Hello, party people, and welcome back to Law and Candor. I am Bill, and I am here with Paige. We are going to talk about a topic that we have been discussing for seasons upon seasons. We're going to talk about how around the globe, legislative developments and regulatory guidance continue to shift the always taxing question of how data can be transferred between regions. I'm going to get extra credit for this. Anonymization and pseudonymization are gaining renewed interest as AI-driven approaches offer the potential for more compliant eDiscovery workflows and the ability to gain deeper big data insights and transparency without infringing on data privacy rights and protections. And to help us understand all of this, including how to spell the words anonymization and pseudonymization, is Damian Murphy. Damian is one of the smartest people I've ever met. He is an executive director of advisory services here in EMEA for us at Lighthouse. He's fantastic. You're going to love this discussion. We recorded this the other day, and he's great. He breaks down the most complex into the easiest to understand, which is really helpful for someone with limited intellect like me. So you're going to really like this. But before we get to that, let's talk about our favorite portion of the program, and that is
Sightings of Radical Brilliance.
This is the portion of the program where we discuss acts of sheer genius and news and noteworthy innovation. And today, Paige, why don't you tell us about this? This is a really interesting one about data.
This article is super interesting. A team at Harvard Business Review put this together. It's called A Better Way to Put Your Data to Work. And really, it's the concept that most of the time we look at data as something that needs to be controlled and managed, but actually it could be used as an asset, right? Almost as a product to better inform the business. And, Bill, as I was thinking about this kind of also leads back to the conversation we had with Kara back in episode 2 about the really interesting things that her organization, eBay, is doing and how her information governance efforts really helped drive business decisions and really help bridge the gap across the business with intelligence about their own data.
Yeah, I mean, so often we hear about how data is, because we hear about it from the legal perspective, right? And so we hear about it from a liability perspective or from a risks perspective. And I think here we're talking about it as an asset. We were talking about there was an anecdote within the article about how data products can generate impressive returns. And there was a customer data product at one large bank, for instance, that had nearly 60 use cases, and those applications generated $60 million in incremental revenue and eliminated $40 million in losses annually. And I didn't get into the details about exactly what happened, but I guess it goes to show you that data can be used as an asset. And I think, we know this intellectually. I think we understand this colloquially. I mean, data is an asset, and that's why it's so valuable to companies like big tech. But it's also could be of great use just for for companies beyond big tech, like banks, like retail. And I think that the more companies are able to do that, obviously with balancing privacy concerns, the more they're going to be able to improve their business.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think it's a trend that we'll be able to watch develop over the next couple of years. So really interesting to see where that goes. So with that, next up is our conversation with Damian, where we get to discuss what data solutions can be deployed to optimize eDiscovery workflows and maximize data insights while adhering to those data privacy laws. Hi, Damian. Welcome to the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the industry?
Yes. So I studied at university where I did economics and English, and I left that, and I really needed some help in terms of just like behaving and being a professional. And I joined Anderson Consulting, which was like enormously helpful in terms of kind of getting me to know how to wear a suit and like do things like smartly and punctually and do things efficiently. But after about 8 years of that, I thought I needed to change. So I left and I studied law, and then I became a barrister. So that means like a grey wig, black gown, that kind of person. And as a barrister, I started to get closer and closer to electronic data, and started to get involved with what I called electronic disclosure, but which in America was known as eDiscovery. And as a consequence of that, I ended up head of eDiscovery at UBS for EMEA and for Asia Pacific. And from there, it was a small step to Lighthouse.
Let's talk a little bit about GDPR, right? And the issues around violations that organizations are grappling with when they're transferring data. I mean, this is far from a resolved issue. So what are some of the recent policy changes that our audience needs to be aware of?
Well, I suppose policy, in the end, policy drives regulation, and so it's really at that point that people probably care more than at the policy point, because you have like the Biden administration, and that is setting some policies as to how data will move between Europe and the US. But we people who are moving the data want to see the regulations, because then we know, okay, right, now we've got to act. So if I focus maybe more on the regulatory side, we're seeing so much in this space. I mean, like, who'd have thought that kind of 3 or 4 years ago, we now would have a China personal information protection law? It's been in force for more than a year, right? And it sets in place data transfer restrictions.
Sure.
So a lot of people think about US, they think about Europe, and they think, oh, the difficulties of transferring data. But in fact, now, so much data is stored in China, so much data is coming out of China and going into China, you're going to have the same sort of issues there. And some people say that what's happening in China is like a positive, because if you read it, you can see there is a real framework for protecting individuals. But on the other hand, other people see it as very much a data sovereignty play, making it harder to get data in and out of China and sort of keeping Chinese control over things. So you've got really, in lots of different areas, expansion of privacy regulations. And then just as a refresher on the GDPR side of things, the GDPR is pretty tough. It plays pretty hardball about the transfer of personal data. So if I've got personal data in Europe and I need to move it somewhere else, I've got to look at that country and say, has that country got an adequate level of data protection? Right? And that means, essentially, does it give me the same protection as I get in Europe? Now, bizarrely, like Andorra has that adequate level of protection, or Uruguay has that adequate level of protection, but the United States of America does not, right? So if a country doesn't have that, then technically you can't send the data unless you can find some other mechanism to use to get that data across there. And there are mechanisms put in place, and there's kind of a sort of different set of things in which you can try and use to try and move the data. And it was an uncomfortable position. Not easy to move data, but it was happening and it was getting there. So we've had, over the course of the last kind of 2 years, what was already a difficult regulatory framework and not easy to move data, it got swept aside, such that even things that people thought, well, we were always going to be safe, like standard contractual clauses, became much more difficult. So that's the position that we're in. And it still isn't easy to move data. I mean, there are mechanisms and there's guidance to try and help. But I think probably the most important thing is what I mentioned earlier on, the Biden administration and the policy there. There's now something called the Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework. And President Biden signed an executive order last month, trying to essentially given that force within the US, but now it's got to go to Europe to be considered. Who knows how long that will take? But essentially, that's to try and give some sort of replacement to the Privacy Shield. So that's kind of quite a long answer to your question, but there's been a lot has happened in the last 2 years. But I think a lot of people are now looking towards this Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework. Will that help us to be able to move data between Europe and the US?
Damian, talk to us more about the challenges that are created now by how the data is being managed as it relates to this and how organizations can ultimately utilize it.
Well, the challenge is, I mentioned that there's mechanisms that you can use, but none of those mechanisms are straightforward, right? Because at the end of the day, there's this sort of fundamental distrust within a lot of parts of Europe as to essentially the rights any government might have to peer into data, right? Normally it's about government intrusion into data. And so that's really where the sort of the suspicion is and the concern that in the end broke like the Privacy Shield. But what we have had is on the European side of things, we have the European Data Protection Board. And that is like the bigwigs, the heads of all of the different countries in Europe in terms of their data protection authorities get together and they try and give some guidance. And they've given guidance about how you might move data, even in this difficult situation. And I think one of the important points about that guidance is, and it's like 6 stages. You've got to first of all, identify what data is going, then how is it going? Then you've got to assess the law in the country that you're sending it to. But the fourth element of that is adopting what are called supplementary measures. And those supplementary measures get us into really moving us close to what we came to talk about, which is because one of those supplementary measures is technical, like encryption, like anonymization, like pseudonymization, that kind of thing.
So let's talk about anonymization and pseudonymization. Other than them being very difficult spelling bee words that I would have gotten out on, let's talk about like how they work in practice.
Okay, I mean they are difficult, and I guarantee over the course of this podcast I'll get it wrong as I try and pronounce them. But anonymization is essentially making data in a way in which a data subject, because that's what personal data is all about, a data subject is no longer identifiable. Okay, now the fantastic thing about anonymization, if you're worried about moving data around, is well, once you've anonymized it, it isn't identifiable anymore. It falls out of the GDPR because it's not got any personal data in. So anonymization is, for moving data, it's the greatest way to move data because you then are no longer within the sort of confines or the restrictions of the GDPR. Pseudonymization is slightly different. I mean, I think of pseudonymization as like, let's say that as opposed to like our names, right? When we did this recording and we did a transcript of this recording, we replaced our names with like red, black, and blue and white, right? And then someone looking at that in 10 years' time would go, oh, red said that, blue. And on the face of it, they'd go, well, okay, that I can still see there's individuals here, but I can't identify that particular individual, okay? But on the other hand, somewhere I might have kept a little note of the fact that who was red, who was blue, who was white, etc. Okay, and that's generally what pseudonymization is you are stripping out, or you're kind of almost coding the information, but it's not all. You've got to be very careful about how easy it is then to get back to understanding who was in that room, because obviously if the only person who's kept a note of who the 4 different people were and the names is me, and I put it in my drawer, that's very difficult for anyone to find. But if, for example, after we did this, we publicized it, and then on Facebook you sent me something about where he said, can you send me over that list of some of the different who was who, and then it's kind of out there so that someone can put it back together again. So pseudonymization is essentially trying to strip out the information, but you've also still got a key there that allows you to put that information back.
I'm reminded of the lunch scene in Reservoir Dogs with Mr. White, Mr. Pink, Mr. Brown, Mr. Black, and them arguing over it. And Joe saying, I'm the only one who knows who everybody is by name. All of you don't know each other. So I am forever going to think of pseudonymization and associate it with Quentin Tarantino scene at the lunch scene, or the Wu-Tang name generator, which, by the way, if you don't know that, go to the Wu-Tang name generator. You can put your real name in. They will give you a Wu-Tang name back. Mine, I just typed mine in while you were talking because I was getting so enthusiastic about it, is self-important mercenary, which might actually be identifiable for those who know me. But please, Paige, continue. Sorry, I just got very excited about pseudonymization. Not only that I could pronounce it, but also how cool it was and how it referred back to pop culture.
Brilliant. Okay, so Damian, talk to us about how these solutions have evolved with the new challenges around data transfer.
Well, I mean, they get better, right? The technology gets better all the time in terms of the way in which anonymization and pseudonymization can be applied. Because if you think about it, right, it's a great idea in principle. Right, to, for example, like we could anonymize the data that we're going to send, say, to America, because we could like take a black marker pen, right, and we could go through, like mark through everyone's names, right, and then take a copy so that there's no way anyone could work out exactly what was said underneath the black mark. But in the end, we could actually like redact so that it was anonymized. Okay. But wouldn't it be a lot more helpful if there was a technology that could say, well, hold on a minute, like you've just been doing that for like an hour. I'm learning here what you're after, right? I think I could have a go at spotting what it is you want redacted, right? And so I think that anonymization and pseudonymization, the link with artificial intelligence is a really important one. And that's something we probably should explore. So that's one element. And the second thing I think we are seeing with these solutions, pseudonymization and anonymization, is they're kind of moving further upstream. So a lot of companies, for example, I mean, we have, right, Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 allows you to, in order for Microsoft to move data around, it pseudonymizes a lot of data, right? But also to allow a company, say, to get an insight into what its state is in terms of compliance, you can pseudonymize data or even anonymize data, because at a macro level, you're looking at kind of big picture things. You don't need to know individuals. So these technologies can also not just be really the kind of like after things have happened, but also monitoring side of things. You don't need to monitor individuals at a kind of macro level. You just need to get trends and see what's happening. So where is data leaving your organization? Do you need to know individuals? Not at the big stage, you might in the end want to focus on an individual, but at the start you want to look at, say, you can anonymize or pseudonymize the data. And again, that just really means there's less intrusion on individuals' data privacy rights. So I would say two things. One is we're starting to see these technologies move upstream. And then secondly, they're getting better and they're being combined with artificial intelligence to make themselves just much more effective at doing these things faster.
So is there a typical approach for a client faced with the need to supply data held within the EU in order to comply with the eDiscovery order in the US?
I think there is a typical approach. I think the first thing you'd want to do is have a look at what sort of, what's the request about, right? Because if you think about it, like eDiscovery, in some ways, naturally is not a ready bedfellow with anonymization and pseudonymization, right? Because if you think about it, most court cases are about this person did this person at this point emailed like that, or this person said this and a recording was made of this, right? So it's often about individuals that kind of give rise to the causes of action that are part of the litigation. But on the other hand, like if, for example, it's about finance and tax and a company's financial and tax position, then query whether or not you do need individuals, right? So you want to be looking at really the nature of the claim you've got to then say, well, what can I do in terms of anonymization and pseudonymization? But I'd say that in general, like let's say you've got a typical kind of commercial dispute type activity going on, then what we would see is that you would, the collection would be done, let's say the collection is done in Europe, right? And you do that collection in a targeted way. So you don't do a massive collection. You try right from the outset to target the right set of custodians. You target by date range, that kind of thing. And then before you ever think about moving that data, you try and do other things with it. So you maybe run keywords against it, right? And again, try to narrow that set of data further down. And don't just then get to a point where you say, well, I've done all the mechanical things, I'll send it now. Then get people's eyes at it. Get people to have a look at it and work out what it is that's still there. Because when you're actually looking at that, you may be able to find other ways in which you could reduce the amount of data that goes. And in particular, you could start doing things like anonymization and pseudonymization, right, where you'd get human reviewers to sort of train to spot these things. And then really, once you've got that small data set and you've done everything you can to kind of remove the personal data or mask that personal data, then I'd say that you would then look to transfer that data. And we find also clients in US litigation might have some kind of protective order when it arrives to then say, well, even once the data is there, like to protect the rights of the individuals in this data, whose data is in here, like some kind of protective order that it will only be used for the purpose of the litigation or something like that. So I'd say that's roughly the way in which people would do this. I mean, it varies case by case, but that overall mechanism is probably there or thereabouts.
Damian, what are the benefits to using these approaches in terms of better utilizing data insights?
Well, I would say that the demand for dashboards, right, has never been greater, although somewhat ironically, it doesn't seem to be the case in cars, where my most recent car had basically almost nothing that you could recognize as a dashboard. But in terms of organizations, dashboards, insight into what's happening in that organization is a really, really popular thing. Everyone wants that sort of overview where you can see in one place everything that's going on. Now, it seems to me that if you have like properly trained artificial intelligence and you understand the merits of anonymization and pseudonymization, you could be in a position where you can get really deep insights into how your company is performing, right? Particularly from a compliance perspective. So, for example, we have clients where we'll be looking with those clients and we'll see like where data is leaking out of that organization. Right? And that a dashboard that you can see where that data is coming out of there. But it seems to me that it's really those tools of artificial intelligence combined with pseudonymization and anonymization mean that you can really do that while still getting the right balance between your desires as a company to know what's going on and your desire to make sure the individuals in that company feel that you are treating their personal data with respect, because that just generates a much more healthy atmosphere in your company generally.
So if past is prologue, the one constant that we can count on is that data privacy policies will continue to change, right? And that's going to impact data governance. So how are anonymization and pseudonymization and other approaches helping prepare for what's eventually going to end up inevitably changing?
Okay, so I mean, it's always difficult to pick what is like on the horizon, but it seems to me that probably there are two things that are just like going to happen. One is that the idea of privacy by design. So privacy by design is when you set something up, like you set a system up, like from the outset, make that system so that it doesn't contain any more personal data than is necessary for the purposes of which you have that system. Now, obviously, if you have an HR system, personal data is going to be at the heart of that. But many other systems may not need a great deal of personal information in there. It might naturally, you might import lots of personal information, but do you actually need it for the purposes for which you've got that system? So privacy by design, baking into a cake, right, the ingredients that will mean that there's a minimal risk to personal data, like all the way through. To me, that's something that's on the horizon, and that's something that, again, technologies like pseudonymization and anonymization give you a really good chance of like making sure that from the outset you are building with privacy at sort of the core of what you're doing. So, for example, Microsoft 365, again, to turn to that, it has like a load of built-in identifiers for personal information. So it can scan your whole environment and it can spot for you, well, here we can see lots of personal information in here of this particular type. We can see it here for this particular type. What do you want to do about that person? You can get insight into it because of the tools that are available. So I'd say that privacy by design. And then the second thing is that I think that getting that kind of, I mentioned already, dashboards, people want that, and that's not going to go away either, right? And again, the more efficient behind those dashboards that balances between individuals' rights and the company's desires to explore, the better it will be. And those technologies are absolutely core to getting that balance right.
Damian, thanks for joining us today on the podcast. It's just fascinating to watch the development of these privacy regulations, and it will be really interesting to watch the Transatlantic Data Privacy Network and keep pace with that. So thanks for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here.
Hey, folks, if you like our show, do me a favor, subscribe, rate us, tell your friends about it, call my mom and tell her. She'll tell everybody in her Florida development down in Delray Beach that she's so proud because she just got a call from one of my fans. Please give her a call, and also really do subscribe, let your friends know, and please rate us. We appreciate it. Thanks.